I'd been living with my son Russell and his wife Violet for 8 months when my world collapsed in the span of a 30-second phone conversation. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was returning from my quarterly checkup with Dr. Morrison. The same routine I'd kept for 15 years, nothing more dramatic than adjusting my blood pressure medication and scheduling my next appointment. I fumbled with my keys at the front door, my arthritis making the simple task take longer than it should. That's when I heard Violet's voice drifting from the kitchen, sharp and excited in a way that made me pause. She was on the phone, and something in her tone, a predatory satisfaction I'd never heard before, made me freeze with my hand still on the doorknob. "I know, it's a fortune," Violet was saying, her voice bubbling with barely contained greed. "But the paperwork is almost done. Once we have the power of attorney, that pension is as good as ours. She's so forgetful lately, the bank won't question it. 43 years of contributions, plus compound interest. We're talking about nearly $400,000. I stood in my own hallway, frozen like a deer in headlights, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss stealing my life's work as casually as planning a grocery list. That wasn't just money she was plotting to take. That was my independence, my security, my dignity. That pension represented every 5 a.m. alarm clock for 4 decades, every double shift I worked to keep Russell in college after his father walked out, every sacrifice I made so I'd never be a burden to anyone. The beauty of it is, Violet continued, her voice dropping to a conspirative whisper, she trusts us completely. Russell handles all her mail now, and I've been gradually taking over her banking. She thinks we're helping her simplify her finances, but really we're positioning ourselves to take control. By Christmas, every penny will be under our management. That's when it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a spontaneous opportunity they'd stumbled upon. This was a calculated, long-term plan. Every helpful suggestion about organizing my paperwork, every concern about my failing memory, every insistence that I didn't need to worry about financial details anymore. It had all been manipulation, grooming me to become the perfect victim. If you've ever felt that moment when someone you trusted reveals their true nature, when the people who should protect you become the predators you need protection from, then you understand the rage and betrayal coursing through my veins. This story gets much deeper, and if you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours, you're going to want to hear how this ends. Please subscribe to this channel, because what happened next proves that underestimating a 73-year-old woman might be the biggest mistake you'll ever make. I carefully backed away from the door and sat in my car for 20 minutes, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't turn the key. $400,000. She'd even done the math, calculated exactly how much my life was worth to her. But what devastated me more than the money was the systematic nature of her betrayal. The way she'd been studying me, manipulating me, setting me up like a lamb for slaughter. You see, Violet had made one crucial miscalculation. She thought she was dealing with a confused old woman who'd worked in a factory her whole life. What she didn't know was that for the last 15 of those factory years, I'd been the union treasurer. I knew more about financial fraud, pension protection, and legal documentation than she could imagine. I'd fought management battles that would make her suburban social climbing look like child's play. Suddenly, everything about the past 8 months made terrible sense. When Russell suggested I move in after my hip surgery, claiming they wanted to take care of me, I'd been touched by their concern. When Violet offered to help organize my financial paperwork because it's so confusing at your age, I'd been grateful for the assistance. When they gradually took over handling my mail and banking, insisting it would reduce my stress, I'd seen it as kindness. But I'd been played, systematically, professionally played by someone who thought my age made me vulnerable instead of experienced, weak instead of wise. Violet saw a pension account and an elderly woman she could manipulate. What she got was a former union leader who'd spent decades protecting people from exactly this kind of exploitation. Sitting in that car, listening to my heart pound with fury and betrayal, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront them. Confrontation was for people who wanted to argue. This was war, and in war, the side with better intelligence and superior strategy wins. Violet wanted to play games with a helpless old woman. She was about to discover she'd picked a fight with someone who wrote the playbook on financial warfare. She thought she was robbing a victim. She had no idea she was about to become one. Let me tell you what that pension really represented, because Violet saw numbers on a statement where I saw a lifetime of determination. In 1979, I was 29 years old, newly divorced, and standing in the Human Resources office at Millfield Manufacturing with a 6-year-old Russell clinging to my leg. The benefits coordinator, a kind woman named Joyce, explained the pension plan like she was offering me a lifeline, which, as it turned out, she was. Every dollar you contribute, Joyce told me, the company matches 50 cents. But here's the key, Beatrice. You have to stay the course. This only works if you never stop contributing, never cash out early, never let life's emergencies derail your future security. I signed those papers with Russell's crayon marks still on my jacket, promising myself that no matter what happened, I would honor that commitment. For 43 years, I kept that promise. Through the factory's 3 ownership changes, 2 major recessions, and countless personal crises, I never missed a contribution. When Russell needed emergency dental work, and I had to choose between fixing my car and contributing to my pension that month, I walked to work for 6 weeks rather than skip a payment. When the overtime dried up during the 2008 recession and my co-workers were cashing out their retirement accounts just to pay rent, I took a second job cleaning offices at night. 5:30 a.m. alarm clocks for 15,695 days. That's what 4 decades looks like when you break it down. Standing on my feet for 8 to 12 hours a day, breathing in chemical fumes that made my eyes water, operating machinery that could take your fingers if you lost focus for even a second. Every paycheck, without fail, 15% went straight to that pension fund before I even saw it. Russell's college tuition, my mother's medical bills, the roof repair after the ice storm of '98. I found other ways to handle those emergencies because that pension was sacred. By the time I retired, at 70, that pension had grown to $387,000, 0 cents. Not because I was lucky or privileged, but because I treated every contribution like a battle won against an uncertain future. I'd calculated that it would provide me with $2,800, 0 cents a month for the rest of my life, enough to maintain my independence and dignity without becoming a burden to anyone. That money represented my freedom, my choices, my ability to say no to people who might try to control me. And now here was Violet, treating my life's work like found money, discussing my security as if it were an inheritance she was owed rather than something I'd earned through decades of sacrifice. She was planning to steal not just money, but the independence I'd spent 43 years building, one paycheck at a time. The move to Russell and Violet's house 8 months earlier had seemed like such a practical solution. I'd slipped on ice outside my apartment and fractured my hip, spending 6 weeks in rehabilitation learning to walk again. Russell visited every day, bringing flowers and genuine concern that reminded me of the sweet boy he'd once been before Violet's social ambitions started reshaping his priorities. You can't live alone anymore," he'd said, holding my hand in that sterile rehab facility. "What if you fall again and no one finds you for hours? Violet and I have been talking and we want you to move in with us, just temporarily until you're back on your feet." The concern in his voice seemed so genuine, and after weeks of institutional food and physical therapy, the idea of family dinners and grandchildren's laughter was irresistible. What started as temporary assistance became permanent dependence, so gradually I didn't notice the transition. First, Violet suggested I shouldn't drive until my hip was completely healed. Then she offered to handle my grocery shopping, since she was going anyway. When my mail started getting mixed up with theirs, she volunteered to sort it all out and bring me anything important. Each surrender of independence was presented as a kindness, a way to reduce my stress and ensure my safety. Looking back, I can see how carefully they'd constructed my isolation. My car keys disappeared for safety reasons. My banking passwords were simplified for my convenience. My social connections were gradually reduced as Violet convinced me I was too tired for my bridge club, too frail for my church activities, too confused to manage my own affairs. By the time I overheard that phone call, I'd been transformed from an independent woman into the perfect Mark, vulnerable, isolated, and completely dependent on the very people plotting to rob me. Russell hadn't always been Violet's accomplice. When I first met her 7 years ago, she was a dental hygienist with a cheerful smile and what seemed like genuine affection for my son. But success changed them both in ways I didn't recognize until it was almost too late. Russell's tech consulting business had grown exponentially, and suddenly they were moving in circles where my factory background became an embarrassment rather than a source of pride. The man who once brought me wildflowers from construction sites and asked my advice about everything from job interviews to girlfriend troubles began treating me like a relic from a past he wanted to forget. Family dinners became performances where Violet showcased their lifestyle while Russell remained silent about our shared history. When their friends visited, I was encouraged to rest in my room rather than join conversations where my working-class stories might clash with their carefully curated image. Violet's transformation was even more dramatic. The woman who once asked genuine questions about my union work and factory stories became someone who spoke about me in the third person while I was sitting right there. Beatrice gets confused about technology, she'd tell Russell, even when I was perfectly capable of understanding. We shouldn't burden her with financial decisions, she'd say, as if 43 years of managing my own money meant nothing. But what broke my heart wasn't Violet's greed. It was Russell's silence. He had to know what was happening, had to see how his wife was isolating and diminishing me, yet he said nothing, did nothing, chose his comfortable life over defending the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. That betrayal cut deeper than any financial theft ever could. After that devastating phone call, I began viewing my life through the lens of a detective rather than a victim. Every helpful gesture from the past 8 months suddenly revealed its true purpose, and the scope of Violet's manipulation became terrifyingly clear. She hadn't just been planning to steal my pension. She'd been systematically destroying my capacity to defend it. The mail situation was the first red flag I should have caught. Violet had convinced me that combining our mail delivery would be more efficient, claiming the postal worker was confused by multiple names at the same address. What I now realized was that she'd been intercepting every financial statement, every bank notice, every piece of correspondence that might have alerted me to changes in my accounts. When I asked about specific letters I was expecting, she'd wave dismissively and say, "Oh, that came yesterday, nothing important, just junk mail." The memory concerns were particularly insidious. Violet had begun commenting on my forgetfulness months ago, always in front of Russell. Always with that concerned tone that made her sound like a caring daughter-in-law rather than a predator. "Beatrice, you asked me that same question an hour ago," she'd say with false gentleness. "Are you feeling all right?" When I insisted I hadn't asked anything, she'd exchange meaningful glances with Russell, planting seeds of doubt about my mental capacity. The banking assistance was the masterpiece of her campaign. Violet had convinced me that online banking was too complicated for someone my age, offering to help me set up simplified access to my accounts. What she'd actually done was create a system where she could monitor every transaction while making me increasingly dependent on her interpretation of my financial status. She'd print out selective statements, highlighting certain expenses while downplaying others, creating a picture of confusion and irresponsibility that justified her increasing control. Most devastatingly, she'd systematically separated me from my support network. My bridge club friends were too demanding for someone in my delicate condition. My church activities were too exhausting for my recovery. My former coworkers, who occasionally called, were told I was resting and couldn't come to the phone. By the time I discovered her plan, I'd been reduced to a woman with no social connections, no independent verification of my mental state, and no one who might question the narrative of an aging, confused mother-in-law who needed her family's protection from her own poor judgment. What Violet didn't understand was that she wasn't dealing with some helpless factory worker. She was tangling with a woman who'd spent 15 years as the union treasurer at Millfield Manufacturing. I'd been elected to that position because I could spot financial irregularities that others missed. because I understood the psychology of people who try to steal from collective funds, and because I knew how to build airtight cases that would hold up under legal scrutiny. During my union years, I'd uncovered embezzlement schemes that made Violet's plan look amateur. I'd caught supervisors skimming overtime funds, exposed management's attempts to raid the pension fund during the 2001 recession, and sent 3 different financial criminals to prison with evidence I'd gathered through patient, systematic investigation. The skills that had protected thousands of workers' retirement funds were about to be turned against someone trying to steal mine. The difference between confrontation and investigation is that confrontation gives your opponent a chance to adapt, to cover their tracks, to recruit allies. Investigation gives you evidence, leverage, and the element of surprise. I'd learned long ago that when someone is stealing from you, the worst thing you can do is let them know you're aware of it. Instead, you document everything, you gather proof, and you wait for them to commit themselves so completely that retreat becomes impossible. Sitting in my small bedroom that night, I made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be a victim, I was going to be a prosecutor. Violet wanted to play financial games with someone she thought was defenseless. She was about to discover that she'd picked a fight with someone who'd made a career out of protecting money from people exactly like her. My first call was to Nigel Thornton, a retired bank manager I'd worked with during various union negotiations over the years. Nigel had always been impressed by my attention to financial detail, and when I explained my situation, his response was immediate and furious. "Beatrice, what you're describing is textbook elder financial abuse. The good news is that if we handle this correctly, we can not only protect your assets, but potentially pursue criminal charges." Nigel's 40 years in banking had taught him every trick fraudsters use to exploit elderly victims. He walked me through the warning signs I should watch for: unauthorized account access attempts, forged signatures on documents, gradual changes to beneficiary information. More importantly, he explained how to document these crimes in ways that would be admissible in court. "Evidence is everything," he told me. "Without proper documentation, it's just your word against theirs." The next step was gathering visual evidence. Using money from a small emergency fund Violet didn't know about, I purchased a tiny camera designed for home security, the kind caregivers use to monitor elderly relatives. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using surveillance technology designed to protect seniors to catch someone trying to victimize one. I hid the camera behind some books on my shelf, positioning it to record anyone going through my papers or attempting to access my financial documents. Finally, I began keeping a detailed log of every suspicious conversation, every attempt to access my accounts, every piece of mail that went missing. I documented dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes whenever possible. Within a week, I had the beginning of a case file that would have made my old union colleagues proud. Violet thought she was hunting a confused old woman. She had no idea she was being hunted by someone who'd spent decades catching predators exactly like her. Nigel's investigation into my accounts revealed that Violet's scheme was far more advanced than I'd imagined. When he called me back 3 days after our initial conversation, his voice carried the grim authority of someone delivering a cancer diagnosis. "Beatrice, you need to get down to the bank immediately. What I've found is criminal-level fraud, and time is not on our side." At First National Bank, Nigel introduced me to Patricia Hendricks, the fraud prevention manager who'd been quietly investigating unusual activity on my accounts. Patricia spread out documents across her desk, like a prosecutor presenting evidence, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There were 3 separate attempts to establish power of attorney over my finances, each with signatures that looked remarkably like mine but weren't quite right. The handwriting analysis software had flagged them as highly suspicious forgeries. "Mrs. Patterson," Patricia explained, pointing to dates on the documents, "these attempts span the last 6 months. Someone has been very patient, very methodical. They submitted the first request in May, claiming you'd granted verbal authorization due to increasing confusion. When that was rejected for lack of proper documentation, they waited 6 weeks and tried again with forged paperwork. The third attempt came just last week." Nigel's decades of experience had taught him to recognize patterns that others missed. "Look at the timing," he said, tracing the dates with his finger. "Each attempt coincides with periods when you were supposedly having bad days with your memory." They were creating a narrative of cognitive decline to justify their legal authority over your assets. If they'd succeeded with that third attempt, they could have emptied your pension account within days. Patricia pulled out another folder, this one containing bank surveillance footage, timestamps. "We've been watching your account activity closely since the second forged power of attorney attempt. There have been multiple login attempts using passwords that aren't quite right. Someone who knows you well enough to guess close variations but doesn't have the actual codes. The attempts always come from the same IP address, and they always happen during weekday afternoons, when most seniors would presumably be napping." What amazed me was how quickly this professional network mobilized once they understood the scope of Violet's crime. Patricia connected me with Detective Raymond Walsh from the Financial Crimes Division, who explained that elder financial abuse was becoming epidemic. "Mrs. Patterson, what you're experiencing isn't unusual, but your response is. Most victims don't have the knowledge or resources to fight back effectively. The fact that you caught this before any money was actually stolen puts you in a very strong position." The hidden camera I'd installed proved to be worth every penny of its $89.00 cost. Within 5 days of setting it up, I had documented evidence that would make any prosecutor's case airtight. The footage revealed that Violet's activities in my room were far more extensive and systematic than I'd ever imagined, turning my private space into her personal research laboratory for financial theft. Tuesday morning, 10:47 a.m. While I was supposedly napping but actually watching through a crack in my door, Violet entered my room with a manila folder and spent 43 minutes photographing every financial document she could find. She used her phone's camera to capture bank statements, pension documents, insurance policies, even old tax returns dating back 5 years. The methodical way she worked revealed this wasn't impulsive greed but calculated, professional-level fraud. Thursday afternoon brought the most damning evidence. The camera captured Violet at my small desk, using my laptop to attempt to access my online banking account. For 26 minutes, she systematically tried password combinations, birthdays, anniversaries, pet names, addresses from my past. When she finally gave up in frustration, she actually spoke to herself, and the camera's audio picked up her words. How hard can it be? She's practically senile anyway. Friday's footage revealed that Violet wasn't working alone. A woman I didn't recognize entered my room while Violet acted as lookout in the hallway. This accomplice, later identified as Violet's sister-in-law, a paralegal named Claudia, spent an hour creating detailed photocopies of my documents using a portable scanner. They worked with the efficiency of a professional team, dividing tasks and covering each other's activities. But the most chilling footage came from Saturday evening. After a family dinner where Violet had been particularly solicitous, asking about my health and expressing concern about my confusion, the camera captured her alone in my room, talking on her phone to someone she called the lawyer. "She's getting worse," Violet said, her voice carrying none of the warmth she'd shown at dinner. "Yesterday she asked me the same question 3 times, and this morning she couldn't remember where she put her reading glasses. The dementia documentation should be easy to establish." That conversation revealed the most sinister aspect of her plan. Violet wasn't just planning to steal my money. She was actively working to have me declared mentally incompetent. The forgetfulness she'd been documenting wasn't random observation, but manufactured evidence designed to support a legal case for her guardianship over my affairs. She was planning to steal my autonomy along with my assets, ensuring I could never fight back. With Nigel's banking expertise and Detective Walsh's legal guidance, we developed what the detective called a controlled burn strategy, allowing Violet to advance her scheme just far enough to commit prosecutable crimes, while ensuring my actual assets remained protected. The plan required precision timing and nerves of steel, but it offered the possibility of not just stopping her theft but ensuring she faced criminal consequences. The centerpiece of our plan was creating a decoy account that would appear to contain my entire pension fund. Nigel worked with Patricia to establish a new account, with exactly $50,000, 0 cents, enough to look substantial to someone who hadn't seen recent statements, but small enough that I could afford to lose it if something went wrong. We then created fake bank statements showing that I'd transferred my entire pension into this new account, complete with official-looking letterhead and transaction codes. The key, Detective Walsh explained, is making her believe she's won before she's actually committed the crime. We need her to access this decoy account using the fraudulent power of attorney documents, which will trigger automatic alerts and give us real-time evidence of the theft in progress. Once she attempts to transfer money from the honeypot account, we'll have her on multiple felony charges. The plan required me to perform increasingly convincing episodes of confusion while leaving the fake bank statements where Violet would find them. Within 2 weeks, she would discover what appeared to be my entire life savings sitting in an easily accessible account. When she took the bait and attempted to steal from it, we'd be ready with cameras rolling and law enforcement standing by. She thought she was hunting a confused old woman, but she was actually walking into a trap designed by professionals who'd spent decades catching people exactly like her. The creation of our honeypot account required theatrical skills I never knew I possessed. Working with Patricia at the bank, we crafted documents that would tell the exact story we wanted Violet to believe, that a confused elderly woman had made a catastrophic financial decision that would make her vulnerable to exploitation. The fake bank statements showed a transfer of $387,000, 0 cents, from my pension account to a new savings account with minimal security protections. The genius of Nigel's plan lay in its psychological authenticity. The decoy account wasn't just a trap, it was a believable trap. The paperwork showed exactly the kind of impulsive, poorly thought-out financial decision that a family might expect from someone experiencing cognitive decline. We included transaction fees that seemed excessive, security settings that appeared inadequate, and account terms that any financially savvy person would recognize as unfavorable. Placing the bait required Oscar-worthy performance skills. I began leaving the fake bank statements in increasingly obvious locations. First, tucked partially under other papers on my desk, then forgotten on the kitchen counter where Violet did her morning coffee routine, finally left open on my bedside table where anyone checking on my welfare would inevitably see them. Each placement was calculated to appear accidental, while ensuring Violet would discover them naturally. To make the story believable, I created a trail of confused behavior around the fake transfer. I mentioned to Russell that I'd been trying to organize my finances, but couldn't remember exactly what I'd done. I asked Violet seemingly innocent questions about bank procedures, claiming I was worried I'd made a mistake with some paperwork, but couldn't recall the details. Every conversation was designed to reinforce the narrative of an elderly woman who'd made a significant financial decision she didn't fully understand. Detective Walsh had coordinated with the bank's security system to ensure that any unauthorized access attempt on the decoy account would trigger immediate alerts. Multiple cameras were positioned to record whoever attempted to access the account, and the bank's fraud detection software was programmed to recognize the specific forged power of attorney documents we knew Violet possessed. When she took the bait, every second of her crime would be documented with bank-grade security footage. The final element was creating urgency without suspicion. I began making offhand comments about wanting to simplify my financial situation before the holidays, suggesting that time was running out for any family member who might want to help with my banking. I mentioned that my doctor had recommended reducing stress by consolidating accounts, implying that I might move my money again soon if I remained confused about my current arrangements. Within 10 days, everything was in place. The decoy account existed with sufficient funds to make theft worthwhile. The fake documentation painted a picture of vulnerable assets managed by an incompetent owner. The surveillance systems were active and ready. The legal authorities were prepared to respond immediately. All that remained was waiting for Violet to discover what appeared to be the financial opportunity of a lifetime, unaware that every step toward that money would be leading her directly into a carefully constructed legal trap. Playing the role of an increasingly confused elderly woman required me to become a student of my own supposed decline. I studied how genuine dementia patients behaved, carefully calibrating my performance to be convincing without being so extreme that Russell might insist on medical intervention. The goal was to appear vulnerable enough to justify Violet's actions, while maintaining enough competence to eventually testify against her. My confused episodes followed a strategic pattern. I'd ask the same question twice during dinner conversations, then apologize with embarrassed concern about my memory. I'd misplace items that I'd actually hidden deliberately, then spend an hour searching for them while Violet watched with what she thought was concealed satisfaction. I'd struggle with simple technology tasks that I could actually perform easily, allowing her to feel superior while she gathered intelligence about my passwords and security procedures. The most challenging aspect was managing Russell's genuine concern without breaking character. When he worried about my episodes, I had to balance reassuring him that I was fine with maintaining the illusion that something was wrong. I began claiming that I felt sharper some days than others, explaining away my inconsistencies as normal aging rather than deliberate performance. I started leaving small amounts of cash in obvious places, then expressing confusion about where money had gone. I'd mention forgetting important appointments that I'd actually deliberately missed. I'd claim uncertainty about recent conversations, even repeating stories that I'd told intentionally to create the impression of failing memory. Each incident was calculated to reinforce Violet's confidence that I was becoming an easier target. What surprised me was how emotionally draining it was to pretend to be losing my mental faculties. Even knowing it was an act, even understanding it was necessary for justice, there were moments when the pretense felt dangerously close to reality. I began to understand how actual seniors experiencing cognitive decline must feel: invisible, dismissed, treated like children by people who once respected them. As the days passed, I watched Violet's behavior change in ways that confirmed our strategy was working. She became more attentive to my problems, more helpful with tasks I'd supposedly forgotten how to do, more interested in my daily routines and financial concerns. She was positioning herself as the indispensable caregiver, the only person who truly understood my needs. What she didn't realize was that every helpful gesture was being documented, every manipulation recorded, every step toward theft being captured for prosecution. The moment Violet discovered the fake bank statements was captured in perfect high-definition detail by my hidden camera. It was 2:17 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 13 days after we'd placed the bait, and I was supposedly napping when she entered my room for what she thought was a routine search. The footage shows her freezing mid-step when she saw the documents on my bedside table, her face cycling through confusion, excitement, and calculating greed in the span of seconds. She spent 47 minutes photographing every page of those fake statements, her hands actually trembling as she realized what appeared to be $387,000, 0 cents, sitting in an account with minimal security protections. The camera captured her whispering to herself as she worked, "This is it. This is exactly what we need." She even used her phone to call someone, probably her sister-in-law, Claudia, and I could hear her excited whisper, "She did it. She moved everything to a simple savings account. It's going to be easier than we thought." 3 days later, the bank's security system detected the first unauthorized access attempt on the decoy account. Violet was using the forged power of attorney documents to try to establish online access, exactly as Detective Walsh had predicted. The bank's cameras captured her at the branch, presenting the fraudulent paperwork with an Oscar-worthy performance of concerned family care. "My mother-in-law is becoming increasingly confused," she told the branch manager, "and we're worried she'll make poor financial decisions if we don't step in to help." But instead of gaining access to my money, Violet had just committed multiple felonies while being recorded by some of the most sophisticated surveillance equipment in the banking industry. Every forged signature, every false claim about my mental state, every attempt to access accounts that didn't belong to her was now documented evidence that would stand up in any courtroom. She thought she was stealing from a helpless old woman. She had actually just handed us everything we needed to send her to prison. Wednesday evening's family dinner was arranged with the precision of a military operation disguised as grandmother's cooking. I'd suggested we have a special meal together, since I'd been feeling so confused lately and wanted to spend quality time with my family. Russell readily agreed, still carrying guilt about how distant he'd become, while Violet practically purred with satisfaction at what she thought was my increasing dependence on their care. I spent the afternoon preparing Russell's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, the same dinner I'd made for his birthday every year since he was 8 years old. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was recreating a memory from his childhood before destroying the woman who'd corrupted the man he'd become. The dining room table was set with my good china, the same dishes that had witnessed countless family celebrations before Violet's manipulations poisoned our relationships. Earlier that day, Nigel had helped me connect my laptop to the large television in the living room, ostensibly so I could share some old family photos after dinner. The laptop contained Detective Walsh's carefully organized evidence files, video recordings, banking records, forged documents, and surveillance footage that would paint a complete picture of Violet's criminal enterprise. The cables were hidden behind furniture, making the setup look innocent rather than prosecutorial. As we sat down to dinner, I watched Violet's performance of the caring daughter-in-law, asking about my health concerns and suggesting we review my finances soon to make sure everything is organized properly. Russell nodded along, still oblivious to the scope of his wife's betrayal. Neither of them noticed that I'd positioned myself with a clear view of both their faces and the television screen. I wanted to see their expressions when their world collapsed. The conversation during dinner was surreal in its normalcy. Violet discussed their upcoming vacation plans, funded by what she thought would be my stolen pension money. Russell talked about work projects and mentioned wanting to help me get more organized with my paperwork. I smiled and nodded, playing the confused grandmother role one final time while mentally reviewing the evidence that would soon destroy their comfortable illusions. As I cleared the dinner plates, I made the announcement that would change everything. Russell, Violet, I thought we might look at some old family photos together. I've been working with that nice young man from the computer store to organize some digital files. The innocuous words masked the most devastating presentation either of them would ever witness. I pressed play on the first audio file, and Violet's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. Once we have the power of attorney, that pension is as good as ours. She's so forgetful lately, the bank won't question it. 43 years of contributions, plus compound interest. We're talking about nearly $400,000. The color drained from Russell's face as he recognized his wife's voice, while Violet's fork clattered to her plate in shock. That's interesting dinner conversation, don't you think? I said with deadly calm, advancing to the next file. The television screen lit up with surveillance footage of Violet in my bedroom, systematically photographing my financial documents with her phone. The timestamp showed this had happened just 5 days earlier, while I was supposedly napping and she was supposedly doing laundry. Russell's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he watched his wife violate my privacy with professional efficiency. The next video showed Violet and her accomplice, Claudia, using a portable scanner to create copies of my pension documents. The audio captured their conversation. "The dementia angle is perfect," Claudia's voice said. "No jury would believe a confused old woman over medical documentation." Violet's response was chilling. "By the time we're done, she'll be lucky if they let her manage her own grocery money." Detective Walsh's presentation came next. Computer screen recordings showing Violet's unauthorized access to my bank accounts, complete with timestamps, IP addresses, and failed password attempts. The evidence showed her systematic efforts to breach my financial security over a period of months, including the successful access to the honeypot account just 24 hours earlier. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most damning. High-resolution photographs of the forged power of attorney documents, side by side with examples of my real signature. A handwriting expert's analysis highlighted the differences with scientific precision, proving that someone had practiced copying my signature multiple times before creating the fraudulent paperwork. "Mom," Russell whispered, his voice breaking, "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know about any of this." But his shock seemed genuine only until I played the recording of him discussing my memory problems with their lawyer. his voice clearly stating that he supported having me declared incompetent if it became necessary for her own protection. That's when Violet exploded. "You manipulative old witch," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of concern. "This is entrapment. You can't record people without their permission." But Detective Walsh had prepared me for this reaction. Every recording had been made in my own home with my own equipment, documenting crimes committed against me, completely legal and completely admissible in court. "Actually, Violet," I said with the satisfaction of 43 years of hard-earned wisdom, "I can do exactly that. And now you're going to learn what happens when you try to steal from someone who spent 15 years protecting other people's money from predators exactly like you." Detective Walsh had been waiting in an unmarked car outside, monitoring our coordinated surveillance system for my prearranged signal. When I turned on the porch light at exactly 8:30 p.m., he knew the evidence presentation was complete and Violet's crimes had been fully documented. Within 3 minutes, he was at our front door with backup officers and an arrest warrant. "Violet Richardson, you're under arrest for elder financial abuse, attempted grand theft, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud," Detective Walsh announced as he placed handcuffs on the woman who'd spent months planning to destroy my independence. The charges would eventually expand to include identity theft, computer fraud, and conspiracy involving her sister-in-law, Claudia, who was arrested simultaneously at her own home. The district attorney later told me that cases with this level of documentation were prosecutors' dreams. Video evidence, computer records, forged documents, and clear criminal intent all wrapped together in an unbeatable package. Violet would face up to 15 years in prison if convicted on all charges, while her assets would be frozen pending restitution calculations. Russell avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with the investigation, but his marriage was over and his reputation in shambles. The man who'd let his wife manipulate him into betraying his own mother would spend years rebuilding the trust he'd so carelessly thrown away. The weeks following Violet's arrest were perhaps the most difficult of this entire ordeal, not because of legal proceedings or financial complications, but because Russell and I had to confront the painful truth of how thoroughly we'd failed each other. My son sat in my living room 3 days after his wife's arrest, looking like a man who'd aged a decade overnight, finally ready to have the conversation we should have had months earlier. I don't know how to apologize for this," Russell said, his voice cracking with genuine remorse. "I let her convince me that you were becoming, that you needed—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. Violet had gradually painted me as a burden, a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be respected. And he'd chosen the comfortable path of believing her rather than defending me. "Russell," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I can forgive you for being manipulated. I can forgive you for not seeing through her lies, but I cannot forgive you for being willing to watch me disappear from my own life without fighting for me. Your father died when you were 12, and I spent 31 years making sure you never felt abandoned. The fact that you were ready to abandon me the moment it became inconvenient is something we both have to live with." What followed were months of difficult conversations, family therapy sessions, and the slow work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by years of neglect. Russell had to confront not just his complicity in Violet's scheme, but his gradual transformation, from the grateful son who'd once brought me wildflowers to the embarrassed adult who'd hidden me from his friends. The success of his business had made him forget where he came from, and recovering that humility became essential to our healing. The Russell who emerged from this crisis was someone I barely recognized, not because he'd changed completely, but because he'd remembered who he used to be before wealth and social climbing corrupted his values. He began visiting not out of guilt or obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to spend time with the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success. Our conversations became real again, focusing on shared memories, current interests, and mutual respect, rather than the performative caregiving that had masked his wife's manipulation. We established new boundaries that protected both of us. I would maintain my financial independence and decision-making authority, while he would respect my autonomy, without abandoning his legitimate concern for my well-being. The difference between care and control became a central theme in our relationship, ensuring that what happened with Violet could never happen again. The money was never really the point, though recovering my $387,000 0 cents pension and the additional $23,000 0 cents in legal fees certainly restored my financial security. The real victory was something far more valuable: the recovery of my dignity, my autonomy, and my fundamental right to be treated as a human being worthy of respect, rather than a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited. For 8 months, I'd allowed myself to become smaller and smaller in my own life, accepting Violet's narrative that my age made me irrelevant, my working-class background made me embarrassing, and my growing dependence made me a burden. But fighting back had reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I wasn't just someone who'd worked in a factory for 43 years, I was someone who'd fought management and won, who'd protected thousands of workers' pensions, who'd raised a successful child as a single mother while building my own financial security. Violet's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my intelligence or my resources. It was underestimating my willingness to fight for what was mine. She saw an elderly woman and assumed vulnerability. She saw someone from a working-class background and assumed ignorance. She saw someone living in her house and assumed powerlessness. But age can mean wisdom, working-class roots can mean resilience, and apparent dependence can mask hidden strength. Detective Walsh told me that elder financial abuse cases usually end with the victim losing everything because they don't have the knowledge, resources, or support system to fight back effectively. Most elderly victims are truly isolated, truly confused, truly powerless against family members who exploit their vulnerability. My case was unusual not because the abuse was different, but because I had the background and connections to turn the tables on my abuser. That realization came with an obligation. I'd been fortunate enough to have union experience, banking connections, and just enough financial resources to mount an effective defense. But thousands of other elderly people face similar exploitation without any of those advantages. My victory meant nothing if I didn't use it to help others who might not be able to help themselves. I began volunteering with the Area Agency on Aging, sharing my story at workshops designed to help seniors recognize and resist financial exploitation. I worked with Detective Walsh to develop educational materials that would help other elderly people document suspicious activity and build cases against their abusers. My experience had taught me that the best defense against financial predators is knowledge, documentation, and the courage to fight back before it's too late. If you're watching this and thinking, this could never happen to me, I want you to reconsider that assumption. Financial abuse of elderly people is epidemic, precisely because we don't expect it to happen, especially from family members we trust. The people who exploit seniors aren't strangers lurking in dark alleys. They're daughters-in-law who offer to help with paperwork, children who gradually take over financial decisions, caregivers who have access to personal information and banking details. But here's what I learned from this experience. You are never as powerless as someone wants you to believe. Even when you're living in someone else's house, even when you're dependent on others for daily care, even when your physical abilities are diminished by age or illness, you still have rights, you still have resources, and you still have the capacity to fight for what's yours. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about how your finances are being handled. Document everything, even if it seems paranoid, dates, conversations, changes to your financial routines. Maintain relationships outside your immediate family who can provide objective perspective on your situation. Never sign documents you don't fully understand, no matter who pressures you or how much they claim to be helping. Most importantly, remember that age is not a disease and dependence is not helplessness. You may need assistance with some aspects of daily living, but that doesn't mean you've lost the right to make decisions about your own life, your own money, or your own future. Anyone who treats your need for help as an opportunity for exploitation has revealed their character, not your weakness. You've survived everything life has thrown at you so far. You have more strength, wisdom, and resilience than people give you credit for. And when someone tries to take advantage of what they perceive as weakness, they might just discover that they've picked a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for respect or defend what's rightfully yours, please subscribe to this channel and share your own experiences in the comments below. There are more stories like mine out there. Stories of people who refused to be victims, who turned the tables on their abusers, who proved that underestimating someone based on age or circumstance can be a costly mistake. Your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. And somewhere out there, someone needs to know they're not alone in their struggle. Together, we can build a community where wisdom is valued over youth. Experience trumps assumptions, and no one has to face exploitation alone. Remember, they might think you're just a harmless old person, but that's their first mistake. And if they try to take what's yours, it might just be their last. Subscribe, share, and never let anyone convince you that your best fighting days are behind you.